Welcome back to our podcast, The Cannibals. I'm Alex, together with Hanrei and Alan. And today, we'll be looking into a well-known murder in Roman history, the making of Titus's bloody meat pie.
Yes, in fact, this murder was also adapted by William Shakespeare into one of his plays, Titus Andronicus. The scene was definitely one of the most shocking parts of the play. A spoiler alert for those who haven't watched this gory part. So in the beginning, Tamora's sons Chiron and Demetrius are with Titus and his kinsmen. Titus has been feigning madness, so Chiron and Demetrius weren't on high alert. Right when they were least expecting it, Titus orders his kinsmen to bind them and slits their throats. He then gruesomely prepares their dead bodies and turns them into pies, and eventually feeding them to Tamora.
I was very surprised when I read this part for the first time, and almost a little disgusted by it. I remember seeing a staged performance of this act, and the actors brought a real pie on stage. I could not forget how Titus dug around inside the pie and brought up a live human skull. That image stuck in my head for a long time.
Yeah, I can relate to that. This is not the first time when cannibalism is portrayed in dramas or films. For example, during the 1970s and the 80s, there was the cannibal boom, which was a genre of film that focused on cannibalism and violence. Those films raised a lot of controversies. Some were even banned, like Cannibal Holocaust.
Wasn't its director Deodato, wasn't he arrested for it? Some said that he could have faced up to life sentence in prison.
So that brings us to the first topic of the day. Why are people generally abhorred by the idea of cannibalism?
You see, what's interesting to me about cannibalism in humans is that we seem to be innately disgusted by it, so much that it's a universal taboo, along with incest and patricide. I remember a case when a man asked his friend to consume a part of him after he dies, so they can be together forever. The meat was well cooked, so there were low chances of diseases, but even with his permission and a good intentional friendship behind this, some of his friends still strongly refused to perform cannibalism.
I guess this is because of our social perception of it. When I hear the word cannibalism, my mind immediately goes to imagine a savage, disorder, and uncivilized state. Like, if we perform cannibalism, we would be no different from animals and barbarians. This perception can repulse a lot of people from cannibalism because we don't want to see ourselves sink so low in our morals, empathy, and humanity.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. But if you look at this from a purely logical perspective, what are the most important things for one's survival? Food and water, right? And other fellow humans are technically food readily available. So why is cannibalism in humans so rare while it's actually quite common in nature, with the praying mantis and the cannibalistic fish, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's something else that overpowers our most basic instincts. An ethnologist, Richard Dawkins, explained in his book, The Selfish Genes, that the rareness of cannibalism is due to natural selection. In ancient times, we needed to defend ourselves from predators as a group, so consuming one another exposes oneself to a higher chance of predation. A group of biologists experimented on this theory with Indian moths. They discovered that the cost of cannibalism and other extreme selfish behaviors eventually outweigh the benefit of consuming one another for nutrition. This explains why we're so innately disturbed by cannibalism, because it's encoded in our genes through natural selection.
Interesting. So natural selection made us anti-cannibalists.
Yes, that's the theory.
That is a logical deduction. However, even natural selection does not completely rule out cannibal activities. For example, in Jamestown, when the settlers grew so hungry that they turned to cannibalism. Or the Donner Party, which depicts a group of pioneers trapped in the Nevada mountains during winter and resorted to eating the corpse of those who had died of starvation and extreme cold to survive. These are supposedly civilized societies.
I think sometimes, under extreme circumstances, our instinct might overcome the moral or ethical restrictions that we place on ourselves. In this case, The desire for survival eventually dominates the abhorrence and the moral values in believing that cannibalism is wrong.
Actually, you are not the only one who believes that. There was once an English colonial administrator named John Crawford who made speculations regarding people's incentives of choosing cannibalism, and his conclusion resembles some of yours. He conjectured that as resources become scarce and societies have not yet developed sophisticated ways to cultivate crops, cannibalism might be quite common to avoid starvation. For example, when two groups go to war, the victors would eat the flesh of their enemies, partly because they hate them, partly because, well, humans are food. Crawford backed his claim by his observations of Fiji natives, who are cannibals. The chief, on hearing the disapproval towards their cannibalistic actions, replied that they have no beef but men to eat. And because this practice has been going on for a long time, cannibalism becomes almost a habit to the natives. They would also collect body parts of their victims, such as heads, and hang them in front of their houses as tokens of triumph.
I think part of what you said ties well with our theme today about Titus Andronicus. Of course, Titus was not suffering from starvation, yet that level of hate that he had towards his enemies made him do something so extreme such as cannibalism. If you hate someone so much, maybe killing them and eating them does not put much of a toll on your moral conscience, much like how the Fujians you mentioned chose to eat their enemies.
Yes, but notice that Titus did not eat the flesh of his victims. He tricked Tamora and Saturninus into eating them, and this makes his act even a crueler punishment. Just as we discussed earlier about our shared abhorrence towards cannibalism, Titus uses such feelings to punish his enemies, and to think that he actually fed Tamora her sons is just unimaginable.
Yeah, geez. Also, in the final scenes of Shakespeare's adaptation of this murder, we see Titus gradually abandons his respected image and becomes mad. His thirst for revenge overpowers both natural selection and moral codes. There's an unbearable fire building inside of him, a desire for violence and cruelty upon Tamora. And the only way to eliminate this anger is to destroy its cause by fooling her into performing cannibalism on her sons. This action just completely annihilated Tamora mentally, and Titus gets his savory revenge.
I could not imagine being in her situation.
Yeah, it's about the cruelest way possible to revenge on a mother.
Yes, and if we look at this from Shakespeare's perspective, he must have repulsed cannibalism as well, because he used cannibalism to emphasize the cruelty of Titus's revenge and madness. He also knew that his audiences would be disturbed by it as well.
Absolutely. After all, Titus Andronicus was a bloody murder.
Looking at today, the morals behind cannibalism are still complicated. Currently, there are no laws against cannibalism in the US, so the severity of conviction still depends on how we judge this action. Some would choose to forgive those that become cannibals because there was nothing else to eat, and some oppose cannibalism regardless of the situation.
There's also the influence of popular culture. For example, one of my favorite TV shows, Hannibal, portrays cannibalism in such a sophisticated and elegant way, and the cooking shots are nothing like violent or barbarous. It just looks like one of our daily meals, making cannibalism seem like a normal thing to do.
You are right. Look at how society has changed. Women are fighting for their rights, and racial injustice is no longer socially acceptable. Who knows how our morals will change in, say, 200 years? Maybe by then, cannibalism would not even cross people's minds because we have enough nutrition all the time. Or maybe it will become a new social trend.
Let's all hope that Titus's meat pie recipe won't appear in a 23rd century cookbook.
Thank you for being here with us today on our delicious podcast. We are the Cannibals, dissecting stories, science, and behind the scenes. Stay tuned for next week's story on Japan's struggles with Fukushima's nuclear waste and America's response.
See you next week.
And she was beautiful, and she